to the Arizona Origin Science Association, Navajo Division, October 2021, final meeting of the year, because we won't be having meetings here in November and December, but we will be meeting back again in January. Just be mindful that there is a camera going on there. And I asked my friend Ron, he would offer a prayer for this meeting.
Father in heaven, thank you that we are created in your image. Thank you, you're interceding for us, and that you have forgiven us. Help us to trust and obey you going forward, no matter what happens, looking forward to your coming. Amen.
So if you attended one of the other meetings that we had here back in July, when we had Frank Sherwin from the Institute for Creation Research, you may have become acquainted, or at least caught a glimpse of this gentleman over here. This is my boss, Dr. Joseph Kezele M.D., and there's his credentials, and he can talk to you more about that. And, well, other than saying that he's a great guy to work for, he's also very knowledgeable, and he's a great communicator, and I can't hardly wait to see some of those slides that you put up there. I assume that we're going to have a little bit of Gary Larson somewhere in this, maybe? Okay, well, maybe not. So he's not going to tell me. He's going to, okay. I get the same that he gets. Yeah. Actually, I have my own little thing where it's like, the pay monetarily is not much, but the retirement benefits are literally out of this world. Okay. So having said that, hand it over to Joseph.
Okay, there we go. All right. Well, good evening, folks. Thanks for tuning out. It's a beautiful time of year with the weather we're having. We're no longer dying of heat down in the Phoenix area. And up here, you're not yet freezing. So, at least not much anyway. All right, so we're going to talk about honeybees and honey tonight. And before we get into the ones that are alive, I thought I'd just mention something that's fun to know about the ones that got encased in amber. And so the question I have here is, how are bees in amber causing evolutionists headaches? Well, here's a quote from one of the secular scientists. He said, bees have probably changed very little in the last 80 million years. So where's the evolution? And the other thing is, not all that far from here, the Petrified Forest National Monument was discovered this fossilized, petrified honeycomb, and the problem is that they appear 100 million years, according to the way the secular scientists date things, before flowers were supposed to have evolved. So how do you have 100 million years of bees without nectar and pollen? Yeah. So that brings us to this quotation from Job. Now, ask the beasts, and they will teach you, and the birds of the air, and they will tell you. Or speak to the earth, and it will teach you, and the fish of the sea will explain to you. Well, instead of the fish, we're going to use the honeybee. And so this honeybee is saying, I mean business. I explain also. So let's get down to business. How do bees use their senses to find nectar and pollen? This is the first of many aspects that we're going to be taking a look at. Another way to ask that question is, how do bees taste? How do they detect odors? Well, they use antennae, which most of you would think would be the case, and also they use mouth parts, which is a bit different than the way we're used to thinking, because they don't really have a tongue like we do. But I have another situation here is, how would you like to be smelling with your feet instead of having smelly feet? All right? Bees use a part of their foot called the tarsus, and we use that same term for human anatomy, so the part that's colored there collectively is called the tarsus. And then that is also part of their collective mechanism for detecting odors. And in that area there are these types of specialized cells which have these extensions, which have openings that are able to pick up molecules that are in the air and then trigger the sensory mechanism and send the mechanism message to their brain. And so this is the part of the tarsus that's been taken a picture of with the electron microscope. So this is an electron micrograph. This is magnification of a zillion times. And so this is how they use their feet to smell with. All right. So would you like to be able to smell with your feet instead of having smelly feet? No. By the way, butterflies smell with their feet also. Well, here is a plant that I don't think you have up here so much, but it grows much down in the desert region. It's called oleander. Do you have that up here as well?
Yes.
Oh, okay, so it's not too cold for it. All right, so oleander has a particular property, and so you see the bee that has come, and then it says, nope, I'm not messing with this. And that's because the bee detects that this particular molecule is there, and this is a toxic molecule. So honeybees will not take the nectar from the oleander plant. Now you see there a marshmallow on a stick, a branch of the plant, and some people who are not knowledgeable will use those beautifully shaped, stiff, sturdy sticks to put a marshmallow on to roast the marshmallows. Then they get to come in and see me when I was working as an emergency physician. I actually had to take care of a patient who did this and treat them with a special medicine, an antibody-type medicine, to inactivate this molecule, because its effect on the heart is toxic on the heart and will cause abnormal rhythms. And it's not only the sticks that do it, the nectar, the petals, the leaves, every part of the plant will do this. So you have to be careful. And so investigators have looked, and they haven't found any receptors for the toxic molecule, but they have come to the conclusion that the presence of that toxic molecule inhibits them from sensing the sugar, so that they don't want to mess with this at all whatsoever. It's very fascinating how God has designed all this stuff to protect the bees and us. One of the interesting things is that some flowers actually provide physical landing strips for the bees to land on in order to go get the nectar and the pollen. Another thing here is bees have very special sensing organs. They're not eyes, but the three things that you see there in those red circles are called, one is an ocellum, singular, ocella, plural, and they detect only motion. They don't give vision. They don't see with those, but if something moves, these things pick up motion. So this helps the bee to be alert that there might be a bird coming towards it to try and eat it, for example, so it can fly off and be safe. And so this is a different structure than what you see here. The ommatidium is one of hundreds, if not thousands, of lenses in a compound eye. The bees have compound eyes that allow them to see tremendously. So the compound eye you see there is encircled by that yellow line, very different than the ocella. Here is the range of field of vision in a person. We can see about 190 degrees, just a little more than halfway around a circle. But the bee can see 280 degrees with those huge eyes that they have. So they have a tremendous range of vision. And so here you see, getting closer and closer, what that eye looks like. And I said it's compound. It has many hundreds, if not thousands, of individual lenses. And so you see them with greater and greater magnification until you can pick out the individual ones quite clearly there. So this is the structure of one individual ommatidium. And so the light comes in through that lens. It then strikes the photoreceptor. That triggers a signal which then goes to the brain, and the bee puts it all together so that they can see exactly what they're looking at. But they see differently than we do in terms of colors. Okay, we do not see ultraviolet. We need, special optics to pick up ultraviolet. But the bees do see ultraviolet as well as blue and green, but they don't see red, the reds that we can see. So when you look at the bottom right portion of that, you can see the shift. So the human eye can see those upper peaks there, and then the lower ones are what the bees see. And you see they do see much less of red than we do, but then the black is there to represent the ultraviolet that they can see. So when we look at flowers, what we see with visible light looks yellow, but to the bee, it looks like that. So you can see it's much more vivid and a much greater visual target for them to go for, to find the nectar and pollen. So here's a comparison of several different types of flowers. What we see on the left to what the bee sees on the right. And same there. Isn't it remarkable how much more vivid it is for them? Now, the question that I would repeatedly say to you, except I don't want to waste all the time, is how does evolution explain this? Right? So in your mind, you can keep saying with almost every slide, how does evolution explain this? And the answer is it doesn't. Because these are designed features. These are engineered features. And you have to have a designer, you have to have an engineer, you have to have an intelligence to bring these things about. Not by random chance events over many years with small incremental changes, because everything has to be functioning all the time. It can't wait for millions of years to start functioning. And so you see here again, on the left of each flower is what we see, on the right is what the bee sees. It's pretty remarkable. Well, here's another thing that's relatively recent, just from 2 years ago, is that the vibration of the wings of the bee as it flies and approaches the flower, that vibration is sensed by the plant, and the plant reacts to it by increasing the amount of nectar and the sugar content of the nectar right then. It's amazing. So that sugar, that nectar is 20% more rich in sugar in response to the vibrations of the bee's wings. Isn't that astounding?
Yeah.
And this can occur in less than 3 minutes. Absolutely mind-blowing. And they can respond to vibrations moving through their tissues. Many release pollen also when insects land on them. So there's not only the increase in release of nectar, there's also releasing pollen. And there's this electrostatic interaction that the charge on the bee's body attracts the pollen. And so the pollen really jumps onto the bee, to the hair. So the electrical charge stimulates the increased release by the flower of the scent and the pollen both. It's crazy. So here you see now the bee has navigated to where a field of flowers or a garden is located, and it can measure the angle from the hive, difference of the angle to the sun and the find of the nectar or pollen. So in this case, there's a 30-degree angle between where the sun is located in the sky and where the source of nectar or pollen is located. So the bee will go back to the hive and do a waggle dance and repeat that 30-degree angle from the vertical. So the vertical would represent the sun, and then that 30-degree angle communicates to the bees inside the hive what direction to go to find the target, the nectar, the pollen.
Quick question. If it takes him 20 or 30 minutes to get back to the hive, how does he calculate that, the angle shift?
In those 20 minutes, that's not going to be that significant of a change of angle. Okay. But watch and see what they do here. All right, so this is a diagram showing that this bee is indicating that 30-degree angle from vertical with the waggle part where the abdomen is very wiggled back and forth or waggled back and forth, and the speed of the waggle is used to give them an estimate of the distance that they need to go. All right? And so here, let's see if I can, there. So there, now it's indicating it's just about away from the sun, going down vertically, a little bit of an angle off. And so the other bees are picking up on the direction and the speed of the waggle. Now you have to remember, inside the hive it's dark, so they're doing this in the dark in the hive. Now, tell me how that evolved. Isn't that amazing? And you can see the pollen that is in the sacs on the hind legs. All right. Well, we have no ability in our own eyes to sense the polarization of light. You know, we do use polarized filters that we put on our cameras to get rid of haze, those kinds of things. But bees can sense the polarization of the sunlight, and this will help them so that you see here that they can sense the angle there between the sun and this line of polarized light there, and as the sun shifts, that 90-degree angle shifts as well. So when it's a cloudy day and they can't see where the sun is, they still can sense that polarization, so they can still navigate on a cloudy day and still do their waggle dance. So the cloudy weather doesn't stop them. Now they get grouchier on cloudy days. My dad and I, when I was a teenager, we kept bees, and we noticed that they were more likely to want to sting us on a cloudy day because they get grouchy with that. But they still can do the job. And so how they're able to do this is the arrangement of these Omatidia at 90 degrees to each other, and that's how they can pick up that polarization. This is astounding engineering, absolutely astounding. So here's an odd question: do bees have hairy eyeballs? You say, what in the world? And the answer is, yes, they do. And so the question is, why? Why did God give them hairy eyeballs? Well, it's thought that this enables them to detect crosswinds and the effect of the crosswinds and how it would push them off the proper direction of flight to get to the source of nectar or pollen, and they can compensate it for that. Isn't that crazy? And here's a very interesting thing. These brains are minuscule, but they can do amazing things. The traveling salesman problem is how to go to the various flowers with minimal backtracking, so you're not wasting a lot of time going back and forth, crisscrossing over the same territory. So they used a bumblebee instead of a honeybee because the bumblebee is much larger and could actually carry a tiny monitor on the bumblebee, and the bumblebee correctly solved the problem, the same solution that a computer came up with, to minimize backtracking. So that's called the traveling salesman problem. Isn't that amazing? So top efficiency in covering the territory. Also, bees appear able to comprehend the concept of zero. So these investigators trained bees to consistently choose sheets of paper, and they would put, sugar water or nectar to lure them to the sheets of paper with either fewer or more dots, training them to land where there were more dots or fewer dots. And then what they did was they kept reducing the number of dots to zero, and then the bees went to the place with less dots, to 0 dots. Isn't that something? And that's just from 3 years ago. So, we have the phrase, calling someone a bird brain, thinking they're not very smart. Well, you could even call them a bee brain, and they would still be very smart. All right, so let's see if I can get this one rolling here. These two bees working together unscrewed this bottle top and threw the lid off the bottle so they could get to the sugar in the drink. Yeah. So then how do honeybees bring back pollen? Well, in this colored region here is the upper part of the hind leg, and as you saw before and as you see here, this bee has the more red-colored pollen in its pollen sac there. And in this one, the yellow-colored pollen from this flower, you can see it's pretty stuffed. And with that electrostatic charge I mentioned earlier, the flower releases that pollen, and it literally jumps onto the bee with the charge. And so the pollen there, you see, it gets into the hairs of the bee's body. And here's the electron micrograph showing that the spaces between the hairs and the size of the pollen are perfectly matched. So the pollen will get trapped in those spaces there. And the bee just happens to have this comb on the lower part of the legs to be able to comb the pollen out and place it in the pollen sacs. Yeah, wow. And so here you see that there's a bee with pollen all over it. Here's another one. So there you see it actually in the act of combing. On the top there, you see the leg, it's combing the pollen to collect it. So here is one fully loaded, and also with extra pollen in the hair to be able to get more than 100% capacity carried back to the hive. So when the bee gets back to the hive then, the pollen is unloaded and they pack it into these cells, and then when the cell is full, then it gets capped over with wax to preserve it so it can last through the winter as needed. So the pollen is the source of the protein for the bees. And that brings us to the nectar itself. So here is the internal anatomy of the bee, and the green is the digestive tract. And so I'm going to first highlight the sucking pump. At first it was thought by investigators that this was a passive process, kind of like capillary action, where the fluid would just come up due to adhesion of the water molecules to the sides of the proboscis, and then cohesion with the water molecules sticking to each other. But we now know that this is an active sucking pump, that muscles are used, and it's just like what we do with a soda straw. We have to suck it up, and it's the same thing with these. And then the honey stomach is the communal stomach. I prefer the term communal stomach. I think that's more accurate, more professional, because this is where the nectar is stored while it flies back to the hive. And then later on, as it needs to, it releases some of that into its own remaining part of the gastrointestinal tract to use for its own energy. So there you see a close-up of that sucking pump, and you see those little tiny appendages sticking out at the very end there. So it does that in order to get a good grip, suction grip, and then uses the pump. And the abdomen actually moves to create that sucking motion. This was caught at 500 frames per second, so you can see that the abdomen contracts and moves back and forth to create that sucking action. Then they get to the hive and regurgitate the nectar out of the communal stomach into the cells, and then they fan. So a bunch of them will park themselves on the entrance to the hive and fan to create air circulating to evaporate the water out of the nectar until it gets to a certain concentration. That's how the nectar is concentrated into what we call honey, by evaporation. So they circulate the air through the hive to speed up the rate of evaporation. And then this is a electron micrograph colorized photo of the claws that they use to hang on to the surface so that they can be stationary while they are fanning, flying in place, so that they don't end up flying off and bopping themselves in the head. So when it reaches that concentration that is correct, and they know how to determine that, then they make wax and cap off those cells to store the honey. And so we have this worker asking the queen, "But your majesty, what's the point of being busy bees if the so-called beekeeper always steals our honey?" Right? Well, if bees earned minimum wage, a jar of honey would cost $182,000. Enjoy that toast. But that's an outdated figure. So I did some math here, and for 1 pound of honey, it takes 556 worker bees flying at a top speed of 15 miles per hour. It takes 4,600 miles flown to get enough to make 1 pound of honey. That means 2 million visits to flowers. At 12.5 seconds per flower, that's 310 hours of flight time. So that's 7,000 hours imbibing the nectar to produce 9 pounds of honey. It takes 9 pounds of honey to produce 1 pound of comb, which we'll get to in a second. Now, that excludes human labor. Also, the work of evaporation and cooling and guarding the hive is also excluded from this figure. So, at the 2019 Arizona minimum wage of $11, that'd be $804,110 per pound. And this year, with a $12.15 minimum wage, $888,000, whoops, there's a comma off there. There's an extra number. The 5 doesn't belong there. So $888,164 per pound. Higher in some other states, right? So enjoy that toast. So here is the wax that you can see they're in the process of capping some of the cells. Some of them are almost completely capped. Some are just beginning. Some totally done. And so where do they get that wax? Okay, this is a bottoms-up picture. So this is the underside of the abdomen, and they have glands on the underside of the abdomen, which converts the molecules, the raw materials, into wax. So how do they do that? Well, in the cells produce what's called a long-chain carboxylic acid and a long-chain alcohol. So this is the result, wax and a water molecule. So visually, that is a long-chain carboxylic acid. That's the part that makes it an acid. That's a carboxyl group. Lots of carbon atoms and hydrogen atoms there, long chain. And then this is the long chain alcohol. So the alcohol that people drink only has 2 carbons. Okay, you can see here there's a whole lot more than 2 carbons there, long chain. So those two are combined. The blue hydrogen in the upper molecule and the blue hydrogen and oxygen lower molecule are taken out and combined, and that makes a water molecule, which you see, and this very long molecule, which we call beeswax. So that's how the wax is made in those glands and comes out in those little plates. And they take those plates and they remodel them into the honeycomb structure. So as I mentioned, it takes 9 pounds of honey to make 1 pound of beeswax. So here you see these beautiful, perfect hexagons, and these are the ideal solution for minimum material for maximum volume, greatest efficiency. And how do they know this? How do you think? All right, so our Lord God, the Creator, gave them that information. Now, when honeycomb is started in different places and then comes together and merges, this shows how the bees will deal with the differences to merge them together with these 5 and 7-sided cells to solve the problems so that everything comes together. and they don't waste any space. And then you see here coming around the edge of the comb how they also do some irregular shapes to maximize the use of the space. So now next question is, how do bees control entry into the hive? So there, I believe you can see on the right, it's a lighter color orange. On the dark left side, it's much more of a dark brown. That's much older stuff called propolis. And the word itself means before the city. Before the city. So this is what is placed at the entrance to the hive, the city, to control entry, because there are other critters that want to come and steal the honey. Not just us two-legged ones, but ones that also have 6 legs, like wasps or other marauding bees. So this helps them to guard that entrance, to choke down the opening. Well, what is propolis made of? Well, the bees will collect materials from plants. So you see here this resin that's on these buds from a tree in the spring. And resin is half of the content of propolis, and a bunch of other things from plants, all in that orange color, are all things from plants, including some pollen and other molecules. And the wax that they produce is 30%, and then all these other things that are in there as well, including a lot of these minerals. So all of this stuff they mix together to make that propolis to control the size of the entrance to the hive. Engineering, once again. Also, they're good chemists. So what does propolis do? It has all of these properties: antibacterial, antifungal, antiviral, so all those types of infections, anti-allergenic effects, antioxidant, anti-carcinogenic means anti-cancer, anti-mutagenic means to stop mutations in DNA, and anti-inflammatory is to calm down the reaction that we have when something foreign gets into our body. Amazing stuff. So propolis is sold and used by people for these effects as well. So then how do bees control the temperature in the hive? Well, both for the much colder weather you have up here in the winter and the much hotter weather we have down in the valley in the summer. Both have to be dealt with. So here are the bees collecting water. So you see there that proboscis with the suction pump, and the abdomen would be going back and forth like this to make that suction action occur. And then they fly back to the hive with the water in that communal stomach. The water is then placed around in the hive, and then they use those claws and fan to use evaporative cooler to cool down the hive. So there's that claw again. Well, in the winter, in addition to putting propolis to make the opening smaller, the bees will use their bodies to barricade so that there's not a cold draft coming into the hive as well. And also inside the hive, you can't get a picture of this, it's very difficult, but remember the combs are parallel to each other and like this, so collectively, even with the combs in the middle, they make a large ball of their bodies gathering together to conserve the heat. I don't know if, maybe you've seen the March of the Penguins, and where the penguins all gather together and conserve body heat, and they take turns rotating to the outside. Well, the bees do the same kind of a thing, and so here's that same type of picture outside of the hive. So they will ball up like this to conserve the heat. Well, how do honeybees deal with the robbers who try and take their hard-earned... So here is an invading wasp which was immobilized so we could get the pictures. And so now the bees are balling around that wasp, and they're going to bake it. So here you see the heat. That was infrared. And see, there's the action of the abdomens. And so they cook that wasp. So there it is, what they're doing with balling the wasp. And European honeybees die at 125 or 124 degrees, Asian honeybees at 123. the wasp will be killed in the range of 110 to 116. So they know to cook it up to that range, but not to get to the higher range. So they're also physicists, as well as chemists, as well as engineers and architects, and aviators and navigators. And
How do they generate the heat?
by using those muscles, moving those abdominal muscles, just like with our muscular activity, we generate heat as well, because the burning of the fuel, the sugar, the glucose, is not 100% going into energy production. That excess energy is heat that's given off. Well, they modify that nectar. The honey is not just the nectar from the plant. So here are some glands in the head that add certain items, and there are also glands below the pharynx and glands elsewhere in the body that add various enzymes. Here, this particular enzyme breaks down, hydrolyze means to break down, sucrose from two sugar molecules, glucose and fructose is together make sucrose, so that's split, so the fructose and the glucose are separated out. So there you see the sucrose being split into glucose and fructose. And so the bees add this enzyme secreted by the cells in their bodies to the nectar, and it has another name. Sucrase is also known as invertase, and it breaks that down so that the sugar molecules are in monosaccharide form, one sugar form. Also, they add gluconic acid. It's an acid, that carboxylic group on the right side of the molecule, and that lowers the pH. That increases the acid content. And the reason they do this is it's antibacterial. And they add hydrogen peroxide, which also is toxic to bacteria. So they put all these things into the honey, into the nectar to make honey, that prevent infection. That's why honey can sit on your shelf forever without spoiling. It's because all these things that the bees put into it. This is amazing. And they also have these other glands, the thoracic gland in the chest, that add other secretions. So these are all the various, or not necessarily all, but the things that have so far been identified that the bees add to the nectar. And so I've shown you that the ones with this kind of a gray color cleave off, chop up amino acids, the proteins in the nectar. The ones in yellow are what break down the sugars, the complex sugars, into the simple sugars. And then the green breaks down fat, and the orange breaks down chitin. Now you say, what in the heck is chitin? Well, that is chitin. Chitin is the stuff that makes these exoskeletons, these outer skeletons of, for example, beetles, crustaceans, and grasshoppers, other insects. The stuff that goes crunch when you step on it, okay? Or if you're eating a crab and you break open that shell, all of that stuff is chitin. Well, chitin is a sugar molecule with an amine group, a nitrogen-containing group added onto it. So these long chains of these sugar molecules with the amine groups, the nitrogen groups, are chitin. Well, why are bees concerned with breaking down chitin when they're not going to be messing with these critters? See, there is the molecule, N-acetyl glucosamine. There's that nitrogen group there in the blue on a sugar molecule, and the chains of that are what make chitin. So this goes on and on and on, making chitin. Well, the reason they mess with this is because chitin is also in the walls of certain fungi, which can get into the nectar in the flower. So that's why and how the bees protect the honey-to bee from a fungal infection as well as the bacterial infection. So there is a plant, a head of wheat with a fungal infection. Well, that can blow onto other plants and it can get mixed in with the nectar or the pollen. And so that's why the bees have these enzymes to break down chitin, to protect against a fungal infection in the honey as well. God always thinks of everything. Well, there's another special secretion from the head gland from the young females, the young workers, called royal jelly. You may have heard of it, and it has a very important task in that the worker bees are females, the queen is a female. They start from the same egg, but the egg that is given the royal jelly by the workers is the one that becomes a queen. That's why it's called royal jelly. And I don't know how labor-intensive this is. It must be very labor-intensive, but somehow people have figured out how to extract the royal jelly from the heads of the bees. And they sell this stuff, and it's not cheap. But you can buy it online. And they also have propolis there and pollen, all sorts of good stuff. All right, so the letter D is an egg that's just been freshly laid. And then letter A is going to grow into a female worker bee. C is going to be a male, a drone. And you see it has a larger cell and a higher cap, raised up cap. And in B are two future queens. And a much, much larger cell, because the queen is by far larger than anybody else. So those eggs that are labeled B receive the royal jelly. Well, this is a hive that's been successful. It's had a great season, collecting lots of nectar and pollen, multiplying like mad, outgrowing the hive. So this hive is getting ready to swarm. So the queen who has been laying the eggs for this hive will take off with workers, and she will land on a temporary landing spot on a branch somewhere, and the other bees will sense her presence through pheromones and be there, no pun intended, to stay with her until the scouts take off and find the permanent place for the new hive to be established. So there is a queen emerging. So behind, left in the hive that they have left behind, eggs were already selected, knowing that this was going to happen, is all part of their planning process. And so this is the first one to hatch out. They make several of these so that there's redundancy. And she will go around and find the other queen cells, rip them open, and sting the other ones, so she will be the only queen alive, and that's where this term queen bee comes from, as not a compliment, right? Okay, because she's rather nasty to those other would-be queens. So there she is, being tended to by the retinue of female workers, making sure she's in good shape, cleaned up, and she does not die, obviously, when she stings the other queens, because she does not have a barb on the end of her stinger, whereas the worker bees do. And some of you may have experienced that. So you see there, this is where a bee was induced to sting a person. The barb stays stuck in the skin, and when the bee moves, the part of the guts are pulled out with, and the bee dies. So the bee sacrifices itself when it stings. All right? So, bee heaven, why are you here? I was provoked and stung something. Me too. All right? And then this one bee says to the other, he wasn't worth dying over, so I didn't sting him. I head-butted him in the eyeball. So you can see his right eye is closed in pain. All right. Okay. Now this is a photograph, amazing photograph, taken in the air, pretty high up in the air, many hundreds of feet, if not 1,000, of a male drone mating with a queen. And so the queen flies up, flies high, and the strongest drones are the ones that can get to her. And she will mate with an average of 5 different drones on this flight. So she has a good mixture of DNA from 5 different males. And then they die. They go out in a blaze of glory because when they separate from her, their guts pull out and they die. So when the fellow mates with the queen, then he's dead. Yeah. So that's why I say he goes out in a blaze of glory. That's it, you know. So here's the queen back in the hive, and she has this sac that stores zillions of sperm. And she inspects each cell to make sure the workers have cleaned it out adequately, and then she will deposit. Here she is inspecting the cell, and now here she is in the act of depositing an egg in that cell. Now, the workers determine what the sex of that egg will become, because if it's a worker-sized cell, only a worker bee will fit in it, so she fertilizes the egg, and it will become a female worker. But when she comes to a larger cell that's meant for a drone, she will not fertilize that egg, and that will become a male. So she can control that. So here you see the newly laid eggs. These will be workers. And then here's the cell on the left. Those 3 are for drones. So she did not fertilize those 3 eggs. And then either the queen got injured, like maybe by a reckless beekeeper, or just died of natural causes, or ran out of eggs or sperm and no longer able to lay eggs. Then the workers will take eggs that are less than 3 days old, add the royal jelly, and remodel those cells to become queen cells. All right, so for a queen to develop with that royal jelly, only 16 days. For a worker, 21 days, and then for a drone, 24 days. The guys are always the slowest, right? So, there we go. So, as I said, the females get the fertilized eggs, so they have twice the number of chromosomes as the males, unfertilized egg. So haploid and diploid means 1 set of chromosomes, 2 sets of chromosomes. You all are diploid. Okay, well, the other fate for the drones is at the end of the season, in order to get nectar and honey, in other words, in late fall, no more need for the drones. There's going to be no more hives swarming, splitting and swarming, so there's no more need for queens to be fertilized, so the guys are all kicked out of the hive. The females just kick them out so they can go starve to death. So the guys either starve to death or die mating, one of the two. But before that, they have the life of Riley. They do no work. They just fly around and eat honey. That's all they do. So that's why the term lazy drone. So we have queen bee and lazy drone here. Well, referring to this laziness from 2 Thessalonians, we hear that some among you are idle and disruptive. They are not busy, they are busybodies. Such people we command and urge in the Lord Jesus Christ to settle down and earn the food they eat. So that the drones don't do that. So, Your Majesty, the workers are discussing the possibility of forming a trade union. All right, well, the word honey appears in Scripture some 61 times. Reference to a land flowing with milk and honey occurs 21 times. Now, here's a riddle from Scripture in Judges. So he said to them, out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. Now, for 3 days they could not explain the riddle. I hear Samson being said. So the men of the city said to him on the 7th day before the sun went down, because a big bet had been made, what is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion? And he said to them, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved my riddle. So there was a little treachery going on there. Yeah. And so here's a picture of a skull of a lion with honeycomb in it. All right. It's the only one I could find because it's some rock group. I couldn't find any other photo of that. Well, medicinal honey. Okay, I already mentioned the antibacterial actions with the hydrogen peroxide, the acidic content. Hyperviscosity means it's extra thick, as you all know. It takes quite a while for honey to pour compared to water. And so that high viscosity is good for making a barrier. So when honey is put on a wound, it provides a physical barrier so infection won't happen. High osmolarity means with that high sugar content, it is going to pull water out of stuff that comes in contact with the honey. And so that would dehydrate bacteria. And it's also a physical barrier to microbes. So here you see Manuka honey, and we'll show you a bit where that comes from, put on a wound. And so it provides that physical barrier, and it has the osmotic action, it has the acid, the hydrogen peroxide, and other enzymes that make this the ideal dressing for wounds. And hospitals are now starting to use this on wounds. And you can obtain this stuff on the internet, Manuka honey. Well, it also stimulates monocytes. Monocytes are one type of white blood cell that you have in your blood. So this is a picture of tissue, cross-section through skin, and this is a monocyte while it's still in the blood. And now you see a thorn. Ouch. I'll do it again. Here's the thorn. Ouch. So that thorn has introduced bacteria into this wound. And so the monocytes are now triggered by the first responding white blood cells releasing chemicals to call forth the monocytes out of the blood into the tissue to do battle with this incipient infection. So here you see the monocyte converting into a macrophage and then traveling between the other cells to get to the site of injury. And that is what macrophages look like. The word macrophage literally means big eater. Big eater. Because it is a larger cell, and it will send out these false feet, pseudopodia, false feet, and will, like the blob, if you remember the movie The Blob, okay, will surround, and you see these bacteria being engulfed, and then it will take them in and digest them and chew them up. So this is all part of the healing process. And this is tumor necrosis factor alpha, which is secreted, which also calls forth to do battle. Well, the bees also add something called B defensin 1. So B defense, the ion ending means it's a protein, B defensin 1. And that B defensin 1 calls forth the types of human cells to the wound to accelerate healing. So not only is the honey anti-infective, it also is speeding up the infection, the healing process as well. Well, this antibacterial activity of honey is good against quite a few different types of bacteria and the types of infections they cause. And I mentioned the Manuka honey. We'll get to that in a second. But here is ulmo honey from the what's called ulmo plant. That's the scientific name there. And this is found in very southern part of the country of Chile. And so the nectar from this, converted into honey by the bees, has active activity against this methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, which people know as MRSA, which is a difficult infection to eradicate. But this honey works against it, okay? And one of the reasons is it has quite a bit of the hydrogen peroxide in it. And so there is a MRSA wound and that kind of ugly wound will respond to the Umo honey. Well, there are other types of infections here. We won't go into all this, but just tells you there's a wide range here of important, significant infections that these honeys work with. Here is the Manuka plant, and this works really well against Helicobacter pylori. Well, why do you want to care about that? Well, that's the bacterium that's responsible for stomach ulcers, gastric ulcers. Years ago, it was always thought that just stomach acid and stress was responsible for ulcers. Then an Australian physician figured out that it was this particular bacterium, and nobody would believe him. The entire medical establishment said, "You're nuts." So he made sure he identified well what antibiotic would deal with this bacterium, and purposely drank a solution of the bacteria to prove it, got the ulcer, documented the ulcer, and then treated himself with the proper antibiotic and cured himself. And then the medical establishment said, "Oh, we guess you're right." Okay? So it always takes us, someone to take a real strong stand to overturn a long-standing paradigm. Same thing with evolution. You all need to take a strong stand to help people turn over that standing paradigm of evolution. So this is where the Manuka honey is found, in New Zealand, where these little dots are. So that's the source for that. And these are some of the molecules that are in this honey that have that effect against the Helicobacter pylori, and that's what the bacterium looks like. Okay, so that's the critter that erodes ulcers. That's what happens when it erodes into a blood vessel. Bleeding ulcers. So it won't take a long time for a person to become anemic from this bleeding ulcer unless they're diagnosed properly and treated. And there you are, Manuka honey. We were in Costco just about a month ago, and there it was on the shelf. So you don't even have to go to the internet now to get it. So the cure for the common cold is elusive, right? Many different things are promoted because none of them work well. Honey works better than most anything else. Yeah. And that would be viral activity. The common cold, those are viruses, not bacteria. So researchers found that the trials had included studies of virtually all of the traditional remedies, such as over-the-counter cold and sinus medicines, as well as antibiotics, and honey. They found that honey proved to be the best therapy among all those lists tested. In addition to proving more effective in treating coughing, it also led to reduction in average duration of the infection by 2 days. So ask yourself this question. How is it that this multitude of enzymes and antibacterial, antifungal, and antiviral agents came to be in honey? By way of secretions from several glands in the bodies of the worker honeybees. By a series of random chance events, or by careful design by the omniscient, all-powerful creator of the universe and of everything that is in it. So, here's a summary. Okay, in amber, bees that got caught in amber caused dating headaches for the evolutionists, messes up their time frame, maybe bad dates as well. Bees, how they detect aromas, how they see, how they communicate, how they transport nectar and pollen, how they process honey, how they reproduce individuals and colonies, the antibacterial and wound healing properties in honey, the pollen, again, antibacterial and wound healing properties. Amazing stuff, amazing stuff. So here's the bee looking at the map of the honeycomb and says, "Face it, Fred, we're lost." Now that's the original caption, but there's something wrong with it. What is it? What's wrong with that? Well, someone said they're girls, they're females, so it should be, "Face it, Frederica, we're lost." All right?
And the shape of the honeycomb.
Well, it's slightly elongated, but it's still a hexagon. So, yeah, you're right. It should be more regular. You're correct. All right, your Cherokee statement.
The Cherokees in North Carolina and Arkansas aren't on reservations, but they really have a very active culture, and I was working with a couple of them, and my ex-husband had gotten pneumonia 6 years every winter. He kept getting the flu. They said, I want you to buy a honey bear and then empty out the honey down to the neck, put apple cider vinegar in, warm it up. I did that. My husband never got a cold again. He never took another flu shot. He never got pneumonia. And when he left, I made certain he had 12 honey bear bottles of honey to go with him. But it really works. I've never gotten a cold, and I don't normally get sick. And it's because as soon as I start feeling any congestion in my nose or my chest, I start swigging from my honey bear.
Okay, so what did you put in that? Apple cider vinegar?
Yep. Boy, that's why they tell you to get a honey bear. I get a honey bear, literally, the one looks like a bear, and you pour out the honey down to the bottom, to where the end of the neck. And then you put the apple cider vinegar. Then next thing you have to do is you put it on the stove very low, takes less than 3 minutes. You spoon it together, and that way the honey never separates from the apple cider vinegar.
All right. Very good. Thank you. Yes.
My grandma said lemon juice and honey.
Okay, I think it's the acid. It's the acid. That's the key. Because remember, vinegar is 5% acetic acid, which is a carboxylic acid. So, and citric acid is also a tricarboxylic acid. So that's the issue. So both should work. Yeah. All right. Yes, sir.
How long can a female bee live?
Depends on the season. If they hatch out in the fall, they can live through the winter and work in the earlier part of the spring. During the height of activity in the spring and summer, they generally wear out at about 6 weeks of age. And then when they realize that their end is near, they will leave the hive, crawl up a blade of grass, and die, so that the workers don't have to cart them out. Yeah, a great question.
Why are bees dying at the rate? I know in Arkansas, I had several friends that had beehives, and they had had them for years, and they lost most of their hives. And this started in 2008. And when I talked to them, most of them don't have the hives anymore.
Okay, I skipped some slides for time, but let me get them up and I'll show you. Okay, this is a little critter, the brown, dark brown oval thing. It's a mite, Varroa destructor mite, and this thing will get into a hive and it will parasitize not only the adults, but also get into the larvae. And so there you see it on that bee, and here you see several at both of the far left and far right of the screen, and they have a hard time defending themselves against it. Now here, it may be difficult to see, but one of the bees is trying to pull the mite off of another bee. And then when they get into the larva, boy, they just multiply like mad. It's like, putting them in a cheesecake factory and say, go to it. And so this is a real problem. Now, we do have chemicals that work on these mites, and they put the chemicals on strips, and you can lay the strips on top of the frames that hold the combs. And so if that is discovered, that treatment can be successful and save the colony, save the hive. No, the bees go about their business. The chemicals will diffuse through the air and kill the mites. And then if the mites are dead, then the bees will cart them out and clean up the hive.
I was amazed on Route 40, I noticed him heading back to Holbrook area to come back down here.
Yeah, beekeepers do have hives around various areas. I mean, we've had hives where the bees were so successful that we've had 4 and 5 supers high, like up to here. And then it's time to say, okay, why don't you guys, we would split them, we'd take the queen out and start another hive and let them.
So we're having no trouble keeping bees alive up in this area?
Well, I can't say that. It all depends on where critters like this spread. It just depends. Some areas are harder hit. Okay, yeah, if you folks need to leave, feel free to leave. So that's fine. Thank you.
What do you feed the bees when, like, we live in a desert? So they don't really have enough food to survive, and where there's nothing flowering or...
Well, you'd be surprised what flowers out there in the desert. And the bees have a range of about 5 miles, a radius of 5 miles that they fly out to. And my dad and I kept bees out in the desert to get the mesquite honey, and they would do fine. Okay, repeat your question here.
Would you eat a teaspoon of honey a day on your oatmeal or whatever you're going to do?
I put honey on my toast every morning. And also, earlier this year, I had an injury where I lost a big giant patch of skin. It was just sloughed off. So I was at Forest Lakes, and I didn't have, a medical kit with me, so I had honey. I put honey on. Toilet paper is sterile, so I wrapped it in toilet paper, then used packing tape on it, and it healed beautifully, very quickly, no infection. I just use honey from the store. Yeah.
Okay, that was my question.
Yeah.
Is processed honey as good as raw honey?
Yeah.
Okay.
I used to keep bees too many years ago, and the Africanized bees we were so worried about. Man, actually, you can't mess around with no smoker, no mask, but they actually produce a lot of honey, and they're very healthy, right?
Well,
not all bad.
That's why the queens from the African hives were brought to Brazil, was to crossbreed them to raise production of the domestic bees. That was the whole purpose of it. But then they got out and escaped, and then over the years, they marched up through South America, through Central America. Even though there were attempts to place barriers, they got past those barriers and all the way up here. Yeah, you don't want to aggravate them, because people have died from the Africanized bees, but they are more highly productive. Yes. Yeah, you definitely want to use your smoker and mask for sure. Yeah. Are you able to what?
Requeen the hive. If it's technically an Africanized hive and you requeen it with a European queen, are you able to essentially regenerate the hive so that they wouldn't be as aggressive?
I would think so. Now, I'm no longer keeping bees at this time, but I would think that in theory that should be possible.
Okay.
But I can't say for sure. All right, well, you folks have been, one more question.
So the wisest man that ever lived said, a little honey is good for you.
Well, you have it from Scripture. Yeah. You've been a great group, fantastic questions, thank you. But even though some of you escaped, the rest of you still have to buy those $3 DVDs. They're list price $13. Okay, make them for Christmas presents, birthday presents, Halloween, I don't care, whatever.
Well, you don't have to. We're not the government. We're not forcing people to do anything, right? Okay. So, but we highly encourage you, and they're non-toxic, and...
Well, I don't know, I might stand at the door and be a barrier here.
Well, okay, we can do something like that. Anyway, thank you all again for coming. If you didn't get the clipboard or whatever, I'll put it back on the table. You can sign up for the emails, and you can be thinking about January's meeting. So, and trust me, this guy Bruce Malone, he's wonderful, fantastic. You won't regret it. So we'll make plans for that, and you'll be on the list.
Are we going to get this?
And this, well, we'll see how long it takes to produce it and get it out, and you may see it for sale here in January 2022. All right, thanks again, folks, and have a pleasant evening.